Hello, everyone. I'm here with Asa Santiago. And Asa, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a functional health practitioner here in Moscow, Idaho, at the Vine Health and Wellness Center. I have been practicing though online as a general health guy. I started in forums and then eventually it turned into a business. I named it Gut Goals and recently renamed it to Polarity Health. So I first start with the gastrointestinal tract and people's health. This leads then into minerals and heavy metals and the toxins that exist in the environment today, and ameliorating these issues to give people all encompassing holistic health. I've elevated this whole process to a place where the hormonal system, like the endocrine system, becomes more efficient. So men and women become more like men become more masculine, women become more feminine. Um, and this also works with people's deeper psychology. It's super fascinating how it all works. But generally, I work from the ground up, starting with the gut and people's health, and we just move from there. That's pretty much what I do.
Yeah, I remember reading about you and your story when I first kind of joined some health forums online, and I know we have a lot in common with that. Um, and your story is pretty incredible, and we can get into that later if you want. But yeah, I would love to get into some talks about diet and nutrition, how that affects our health, and I think we'll try and enlighten people on just how much diet and nutrition can affect our mental well-being and our health, because I don't think people really realize it uh, the way that we do, at least. But I definitely really want to talk to you about polarity, and I've been, like I was telling you before, I've been doing a lot of thinking and some writing about sexual dimorphism. And have you ever heard of Robert Sapolsky, Professor Robert Sapolsky?
No, I haven't.
He's a behavioral biology professor at Stanford University, and he has this really good lecture series, and it's all on YouTube and it's all free. And he's just a really good speaker, and he's really interesting. But he talks about pair bonding species, and it's a bit of a spectrum from pair bonding species to tournament type species. So on one side, you have pair bonding species such as penguins, and those penguins, the males and the females, they look pretty much identical. Like if you look at them, it's hard to tell one from the other if one's male or female. And they also, like the name suggests, pair bonding species, they mate for life. And the males don't really fight over females because they each get one female, and instead of fighting, they'll bring the female penguin like a nice shiny rock or whatever. And then on the other side of that spectrum, you have something like elk, a creature like elk, where you can just look and at an instant you notice that the males are different from the females, right? You see the huge antlers, the huge testicles, they're like twice the size of the females. And what these tournament species do is they compete with each other. The males compete and they all fight. And then at the end of the day, there's one winner, and that one winner has mates with all of the females pretty much, more or less. And then that one male has tons of offspring, whereas the rest of the males have pretty much no offspring, at least for that season, right? So you have this really big difference where the distribution of how many offspring a male will have, for penguins, pretty much all males have the same number of offspring. But for elk, there's like one male with lots of offspring or a few males with lots of offspring, and then a bunch of males with no offspring. And then the females are kind of in the middle on the average. And humans, I would say, would you agree, lie somewhere in the middle of that?
Yeah, that's an interesting argument. I guess he has a terminology that he uses as far as tournament species are concerned. I've always called it the stag theory,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and so I do. That's the thing is if you look uh, at the studies that exist today surrounding anything in the endocrine system and psychology and just following general anthropology, and you're looking at tribes, the tribes that have so much more competition and tournament like ways of being. it's not that they, mate with just one, like one guy gets all the women, but there is competition there where the men who bring in the most meat or do the best in society are rewarded with much more societal kind of gratitude and
Mhm.
him feeling so much more accomplished.
And
And that person
first pick at the women, right?
probably, they didn't
Mhm.
really go into that in the study I'm referencing, but they did go into how it elevated this man's testosterone more than the others.
Mhm.
So it goes into how testosterone is in a lot of ways based on perspective. And if you look at society today, men who do have more testosterone, you could easily say they can be somewhat competitive. And whether this applies to the romantic dynamic or not is not fully elucidated. I think that I think a lot of people will be very upset to find out if we were truly more of like a stag species where it is supposed to be based on like competition, and then the better man is the one who would be procreating. But we do also have a heightened level of intelligence, and each woman has more of a need within relationships uh, than say, for instance, a doe. I imagine there's so much more involved and more
Mhm.
nuance. So it could definitely say that we could definitely make the argument that we are meant to have just one person for a long time, because we develop these really deep connections, and it's hard to say what stags and a doe do and the context of that. So
Yeah.
it's definitely an interesting topic for sure, and I love talking about it. But it's also kind of like, because it's one of those things I haven't fully resolved in my brain. I have a lot of answers to life, but that one in particular is still a big question mark for me, because the more I go through being better in health and higher testosterone, the more I realize that like it's so much easier to select women and to just be, to have any woman that's in front of me, just like, hey, I can choose the one that's best for me. But then you have that perspective of like, well, if you're just that great and so much separate than the other men, would you then be able to have multiple? And I don't really think in that spectrum, because, I'm pretty happy and content with my gal now. So I don't,
Yeah,
it's
I may have
hard
misled
to,
you. I'm not at all trying to push polygamy or anything. I'm a big fan of monogamy, and but I think one of the nuances that makes humans a lot more monogamous than you would expect is that our our babies are born at such a young age developmentally, right? Because of our much larger brains and because humans walk on 2 feet, and that changes the hip structure of women, right? That means that it's very hard to give birth to a baby with a huge brain. And from what I understand, if humans were to go through a gestation period kind of fully, so that when the baby comes out, he or she can kind of do something like regular animals do, and they weren't just like a, a limp 9 pounds of flesh, right? That can't do anything. Um, Humans would actually have a gestation period closer to like elephants, like almost 2 years or something like that. But because our brains are so big, it makes pregnancy really difficult. So women give birth to babies who are much younger developmentally, and then because of that, fathers kind of evolved to take more of a fatherly role. So the men who took on a more monogamous, stable relationship and were more fatherly and stuck around, their children were able to be born earlier and also able to grow bigger brains.
nice. Hmm,
Yeah,
interesting.
and what I wanted to get into further is uh, where I was going with that with the elk and how there's a huge distribution of reproductive success. There's also a large distribution in. Have you heard of the male variability hypothesis?
No.
It basically suggests that And I think it's kind of obvious in a lot of ways. And if you just kind of look in real life, it basically suggests that the variability between males is much greater than the variability between females. Which is to say, if you look at something like almost any metric, like from like limb length to like skill or ability, like even IQ, and that's where like it's kind of hotly debated at times because everybody's sensitive with IQ. But if you look at IQ, it looks like if you look at the people who are geniuses and have really high IQs, more of those people are male. And if you look at people who have really low IQs, more of those people are male as well. And then, but the averages are the same. So men and women both have an average IQ of 100, but the distribution is different.
Mm.
And and I see this, like people have known for a really long time that males are more likely to have mental deficiencies and handicaps. And, you know, but then on the other side, and nobody complains about that, but then on the other side, when there are more male geniuses and inventors, people will say that it's because of the patriarchy or something. But um, anyway, with that, I've been thinking about why that is, and I think a really big reason for that is it's a bit of a strategy, right? Because if you have it's a lot the reproductive process is a lot more difficult for women, obviously. They have bigger gametes and they invest a whole lot more in reproduction than males do. And so it's tougher and they can only reproduce so many times in their lifetime. Whereas like a man could potentially reproduce almost endlessly as long as women will let him, right? And so if let's say like you have 100 people and 50 of them are females, 50 of them are males, and you're trying to like evolve your island population as best as you can, right? One strategy might be to you would you would want to roll the dice and be a little bit more risky when it comes to making males because you could have, as long as you have a couple really great males and their genes got to the next generation, then that's great, right? Because you could have all of the females making a baby and they are kind of uh, they're more average and in the middle and they're stable and like, you know, nothing terrible, nothing, I mean, I don't want to use these words, but like, you know, like they're all kind of in the middle in terms of health and well-being. But then you have males being more variable, but that's okay because you can have the top males reproduce with all of the females and then the bottom males don't end up reproducing. And this does happen to some degree. It's just an argument of what degree is is it happening at and what degree is optimal, right? Because we have more female ancestors than we have male ancestors.
Mm. Interesting.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. I was also looking at I was also trying to think of, so that's called inter-individual variability, wherein there's more variability between different individuals. But then I was also thinking about it being a greater intra-individual variability. So you have this phenomenon where males are more likely to be good in one small domain but terrible in other domains, such as autistic savants, right? And autistic savants in that population, males outnumber females about 4 to 1, apparently. And I mean, you even just see this in schools, right? It's much more likely for a girl to, if she's doing really well in math, she's almost certainly also doing really well in science and art and literature and all of that. But it's if a boy is doing really well in math, they are more likely to be doing well in the other subjects, but that is it's less of a predictor than it is for females. So a boy is more likely to be excelling in one subject but doing terribly in the other subjects. and so there's more intra-individual variability. And I was trying to think of why that would be, and I was realizing that I think it comes down to the process of androgenization in the womb, and basically at certain stages, one part of your brain might be developing, right? So you might have your whatever part of your brain is responsible for visual spatial senses developing at one point, and then like a week later your social, cognitive, and language ability regions of your brain are developing. But let's say you have ample nutrition during that first week, and then your mother is really stressed or sick or whatever's going on, or she's not eating well that second week. It what is making it more likely for a male to experience the highs and the lows, right? And I was trying to figure that out, and then I researched it, and apparently, like, it was like the second article I found. What male fetuses do is they eat more of the nutrition as it comes in, and what female fetuses do is they bank more of that nutrition into the placenta. So it's really fascinating. So females will kind of play it more conservatively and bank a lot of nutrition into the placenta, and then but the males will kind of eat as it comes and worry about the future later. So you can see how in that situation, if the mother is really well fed the entire time and really healthy and low in stress the entire time, then that works out really well. So it's high risk, high reward, right? It works out really well for the male. But if there's a problem, it works out really poorly for the male. And for the female, it's kind of like she cuts her losses. It's not going to be great. It's not going to be terrible because she's kind of built up this placenta, right? And people kind of think of it as like a mother is growing the baby, but really I think we need to think of it as the other way around. Like the baby is growing from the mother, and the baby is almost calling the shots, because like it's like the baby has his foot on the gas and the mother has his foot on the brakes, and like the act of love that a mother performs is kind of not putting her foot on the brakes too hard and being like, okay, yes, you can take from me, right? Like that's kind of the act of love that a mother performs in the growth of her baby, right? If it
Wow.
was up to her, growth would be really slow and you know not super fast. But if it was all up to the baby, growth would be fast, 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 right?
Yeah. Wow. Crazy. That I did not know that. That's awesome. The
Mm-hmm.
babies are take they even the males as they're not even a lot like fully like as a human or anything like that, or like nothing. It's like or sorry, any kind of animal that's like in a full stage, like the male is already just going for it, just total risk taker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's like they're risk takers. Males are high risk, high reward when they're teenagers and adults, but they're also high risk, high reward when they're in their mother's womb. Like it's so
Yeah,
cool.
that's
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah. And
Yeah.
that's obviously not socially constructed, right? Like, I mean, you can't argue that that's socially constructed.
No, no, it's definitely just it's inherent in what's likely their endocrine system, their hormones.
Hmm.
Um, if you're flooded with androgens, you're just going to be more of a risk taker. This is what it is.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Yeah, so does that fit into kind of what you see with, healthy uh healthy hormone levels and what a healthy male looks like? Maybe you can tell us a bit about how you see healthy men and healthy women.
Yeah. So that's really complicated because you can definitely see a lot of people who are like in Hollywood and they look magnificent. Like one woman looks like a model, one guy looks like a model, but then you don't have the full translation until you see them in a relationship dynamic,
Hmm.
and the psychology really plays in there. And so there are a lot of women who may look very feminine. Maybe they even walk really feminine and they talk really feminine. They even have a feminine voice and they sing and everything. But then the back end, they might be telling people what to do at the house, being in full command. And these are masculine roles. And it's kind of controversial today. A lot of women seem to think that that's kind of the way to go. But
Hmm.
this messes with a gal's endocrine system ultimately. Like An example can be when I was working with one of my clients, just a gut goals client, and he got real fit, feeling really good with his gut and everything. And then I started making posts about polarity, and he was against it for a while. And then eventually he tried it with his wife. His wife was a little more high-powered corporate person, and after years of failure to conceive, they managed to finally conceive because she decided to become more vulnerable and more feminine and sweet. And so, with that reality set in mind, it's kind of like, well, it's very likely that just because you look and talk real feminine, that it doesn't make you entirely feminine, and it very much does affect your health. And if you want optimal health and you want an optimal family, you have to do all of it. You can't just be the parts that you like that are feminine and then hold
Right.
on to all of the masculine things that make you feel safe. That men are supposed to make you feel safe. But if you can't trust men, that's not only a problem with society, but it's a problem with the men that you're meeting and attracting. But in general, good men don't need to be regulated, and they very much do well in relationships when they have power. And this is central whenever I'm coaching guys, like when they're running a polarized relationship, they've already failed if they take all that power and they step on the flower that is their girlfriend. You know, she's only giving him that vulnerability and trust because she really trusts him. She really loves that man and it's really letting go.
Yeah, it's a
And if
very
he
risky
decides,
act. Yeah.
yeah, and if he decides to trample on that, like he's just totally ruined it all, and he's creating why like people men like that are the reason why feminism exists today and the way that it does. Women should have some level of rights so that they can't be trampled on, right? Protected by the institution. But on some level, men in relationships do so much better free flow when the woman fully trusts him. But that can't happen with a bad man. And so we're today going back to the health equation, like filled with disease, and men are prone to becoming bad men simply because of their health. Like, for one extreme example, can be like bipolar depression, right? And I'm not going to be making any medical claims here, but I'll say that I know from experience with people who have it, they can enter these manic episodes based on some trigger. And in some cases, they can be so stuck in that they're seeing red the entire day and just cruding all over all the people they love. And they're dangerous. And so when it comes to that, like say it's the man of the household who's like that, uh, no one's safe. No one could be like no one could trust him to
Hmm.
like be able to lead because he could very easily lose it. And then she has to bring her defenses up. That's not conducive to any healthy relationship. So someone who has that particular issue would very much struggle to lead a healthy polarized relationship where a woman could fully trust. She will have to masculinize to survive that relationship. So the whole marcation for women masculinizing, the majority of it just comes from their need to defend themselves, their need to bring on the masculine for self-defense purposes, because the society around them is enforcing that, and in their relationships. So guys, it, they often deceive, they do the wrong thing because they're in power. Because I mean, there's that old quote, right, where if you truly want to test a man's character, give him power. And polarity is that. And I try to influence women to first start with letting men have power, because you can still have your discernment. You can sit back and watch, right? So if a man has power and you notice slowly he's trying to like, steer you in the wrong direction, or he's going to steamroll you, then that man doesn't do well with power and you should not be with that man.
Hmm.
So the whole power dynamic is it's just how it's a really big part of the whole uh, deal with the polarized relationships. And so people who have poor health don't choose well when it comes to these power dynamics or having any kind of a decision with power. They can end up being more self-serving uh, there are various neurotransmitters in our bodies. There are hormones that are signaling hormones, and they can affect how our mood is day to day, and it affects our desires throughout the day. So if you're a man working a desk job and you are relatively higher testosterone, say you're like the 800, 1,000 range, and you have a greater need to fulfill that, to be more action oriented, more violent, to more go and do things that are competitive, and you don't fulfill that in the day, you can end up with a deficit coming home. So this man can end up just going and doing anything from playing video games to looking at porn to eating a bunch of junk food to taking drugs to being abusive to his family. So I call it orders of fulfillment. You know, both men and women need it, but men in particular, the one I'm bringing up right now, if they're very commonly stuck in jobs where they're not reaching fulfillment, and so they seek that fulfillment elsewhere, and it's all hormonal. So when men understand their hormones, they understand the problem. That it can be fairly well mitigated, and that's another reason why I might promote like, hey, it's better to play a video game than to be involved in drugs or eating a bunch of junk food, right? So if you do that in a healthy way, it can help you fulfill your day as a man. A lot of society doesn't understand that men do need these things. And each man is different, and then it depends on their hormonal status. Like some men absolutely abhor the idea of competition, but ultimately competition is what leads to higher and well-maintained testosterone. That on top of like building muscle tissue and just, it's just in general like and it's not hard. Like you don't have to go and fight people. Like you could just go and like make a mental battle with someone that you are making up as your rival. Like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, this person in this area is like doing this thing. I'm gonna do better than him.
Yeah.
And like whatever you got to do to be competitive, it's important.
Is it a bit of a
Um,
vicious cycle where the more testosterone elevating things that you do, the more testosterone you have, the more testosterone you have, the more testosterone elevating things that you want to do? Is it a bit of a vicious cycle like that? And it can go both ways, right? It can make you kind of downward spiral or upward spiral.
it could be a vicious cycle if your lifestyle isn't conducive to it. So it's like the desk job thing.
I don't know
Higher
what the
testosterone.
positive term is for vicious cycle, like what it is when you're like going on an upward spiral. I don't know what you call it, but like basically what would I don't know what the opposite would be, right?
Term for that.
Yeah, because you could definitely have a downward spiral with, like you were saying, like if they're not doing those masculine things that they want to do during the day, and then they come home and they watch porn or something, and then doing that lowers their testosterone. Then they have lower testosterone, so they're doing less testosterone elevating things, and then so they just keep doing that. But it goes both ways, right?
Yes. Yes. Like if you were higher testosterone and say you were you were a lumberjack and you made enough money to support your family, that's great. Like you probably can go home and just be totally good to just, you know, be with your wife and be with your kids, and you might find that fulfilling. But a lot of those guys will still go and eat like all the worst foods, but they may just not know, right? So they also too are different than everyone else because they're probably burning the calories off. They're burning the glucose down. Like a lot of that glucose that could have, with a sedentary person been given to a bunch of microbes in the body and gone in
Hmm.
various bad directions, then yeah, that's a problem. And but so the nature of like having an active work environment is supportive of people who can, they can eat more glucose than others and have less parameters of
Yeah,
disease.
their metabolism is
And
going at a higher rate. Their furnace is burning hotter.
yeah, so those people can go through their lives not really noticing a lot of problems, because if a man is totally fulfilled on an endocrine level, like where they're pretty blue collar and they're making enough money to support themselves and they're meeting all their needs, yeah, I mean, it's hard for them to need someone like me. They don't they're pretty good. Even if they were eating potatoes, and I could tell them all about the nightshade plant toxins and the issues with potatoes, like, but they're eating the majority of their meat is diet is hyper carnivorous. They're eating mostly meat, and they're actually hitting all their macros each day and all their micronutrients, and they're relatively good about that. Like, okay, that potato's not really doing much of anything to this person. Like,
Hmm.
this person is super active. They have a fulfilling life, and they're getting their basic needs met. Like, the only thing that this person can improve on is really like they would just be entering a phase of uh, maybe going down to, like, if you want to be extreme, like raw food, like Derek Nance, right, where you're eating only raw meat and you want it to be more bioavailable. But that man again can develop gastrointestinal issues when trying to eat raw meat because their gut isn't well associated with raw meat, so they can end up not absorbing it quite as well. So it gets complicated. But yeah, ultimately that's like for women too. Like, if they feel safe at home and they have a masculine man and they have family around her, she has family around her, she has community, she feels loved, and she has something to take care of, and she, just gets to support, like the man as an example. She can feel very much fulfilled in that, and she would too also not need as much. But it could be challenging for women because they tend to be, as homemakers, more sedentary. They do need to find a way to involve themselves on a physical level that they can, like, kind of think of in a kind of blueprint tribal way, where, as a mother she would still be, carrying the kids, or I don't know, probably lifting
Yeah, man,
big
those
things as
babies are heavy,
sticks, or
man. They're hard to carry all day. I've got some nieces, and it's just like, how do you do this? But
yeah.
yeah, and you're right. Like the one thing that's kind of different about maybe gender roles is like the males is maybe more aligned with kind of like an evolutionary fit with how we would live. And yeah, I could see that being a problem if a woman was a housemaker and more traditional like that, but then she's not getting outside as much and she's not being as active, right? Yeah, not
Yeah.
getting as much sunlight and
Yeah, yeah, that's those are problematic features. So I mean, really, when you break it all down, health is measured by the truths that we live, based on nature. So anything that we do that's different from what we would be doing out in nature is going to contribute to more disease. Ultimately, uh, we need to get a certain amount of sunlight in the day, a certain amount of exercise, all these nutrients. But at the same time, too, like, if you're in the wild, you're not eating every single day of your life. So I try to explain to people that there's that component of fasting that can be very important to their health, just for general cellular upkeep and the removal of pathogens from our cells. Super important, just all around, to just kind of think in that sphere of
mhm.
being out in the wild and what would be there. And so I try to explain that to people who are more plant based. Like, you would need agriculture to do that. So if you got dropped in the wild, you would never find enough plants to be able to
Yeah,
subsist on.
and they would kill
No
you, all the
chance.
plants that you eat. Yeah,
Yeah, so there's
yeah,
only so much available. It's a lot of the time you eat them, like you're saying, they have consequences that are deleterious. Like, if you don't have salt on you, then you're gonna become electrolyte deficient really quickly. And so it just going meat based is pretty much the from end to end, from any geographical location in the world. It's all set up and formatted to be meat based. Whether
hmm,
you're out in the north where it's all super cold, where it's mostly just almost entirely meat, or you're down in the tropics and there is fruit around, but there's still more meat around than there is fruit around.
yeah,
And we're not necessarily designed to be able to eat only fruit like a frickin' toucan. I
yeah.
think toucans eat fruit, right? I don't
I
know.
don't know. They eat Fruit Loops.
Anyway, fruit loops. That's funny. Um, but yeah, so it's just kind of it's interesting how that works. Um, because I know from my own experience in Maris, that's what how I do best with health, and how I've helped others is just bringing them back to the truth, back to what we're supposed to be doing, and that's generally going to be more meat based. I'm not in the boat necessarily anymore where everyone should just be eating only meat.
Hmm.
I definitely did really well on that, and I think a lot of people do, but I think they're doing well because they're putting microbes into remission. They're shutting them up. The microbes can't come out, and they because due to a lack of glucose. But then over time, they develop problems like gout, right? And they're like, why do I have gout on my carnivore diet? It should be no problem. And this can be due to fungus that was previously there, just hanging out in the joints, and they're metabolizing the purines, and that turns into uric acid, and then you have gout. So a lot of people long term develop these issues just out of nowhere, and they can't really trace it to, they just believe that purines are the cause. But in reality, it can be something so much more than that. It can be the reason why carnivore worked for them in the first place. Molds and yeasts, they just hide. They don't just straight up die with carnivore. A lot of them die, but a lot of them just drop right into the tissue and just chill there, and they survive on what they can. And then whenever you screw up and eat that ice cream, they're just like bam, right in your face.
Yeah.
So that's largely why people's cravings can end up getting super twisted after they eat that first amount of carbs, and then all of a sudden they're wanting more carbs again. Yeah, they have to be super aware of that. I think there's some natural component to it too. I've been thinking about it, like because when you go fasting, you could technically be fasting based on the winter perspective, and you're going through the winter, you have less food, and you're fasting, and you get back out, and your body's actually craving more carbs. That may actually be somewhat natural because if you were to come out of a winter season, there would be more carbs available when you come out of it, and so your body could naturally accumulate those carbs to build up more fat stores. Not that you'd need to. It depends on the geography, and I think genetics apply here because if it's not a super cold area, and it's just like an average smaller kind of a winter, so you're like California as an example. I mean, it's not really much of a winter at all. Um, you could technically come out to want to eat those carbs that are available, and you'd be able to use necessarily, like for instance, when I was doing carnivore and I added like some oranges, it's like, okay, I get inflamed from the oranges, but after a while, um, my body gets used to it, and the oranges are actually helping me to elevate and make my testosterone more efficient, and it's super fascinating. It also helps me with just antioxidants, as applying supplying antioxidants and enzymes to generally make inflammation less bad, because that will also raise cortisol, which lowers testosterone. So I see the benefits of the fruit. It's just I think that we're getting inflamed from the fruit because of all the other microbes that are around. The white blood cells will come in and create inflammation around the microbes, and so that makes it more confusing. But generally, like for me now, um, I'd say that that's probably the truest reality is like dealing with the microbes on like a fasting level. Like I'll eat in like an abundance period, mostly meat based, and then I'll dedicate after I develop more fat. I just fast it off and use that to get deep tissue healing, and all of a sudden I have these permanent health changes. I think over time, when people do more of this dry fasting cyclically, they can permanently reel back the reason why they're getting inflamed from the fruit. Um, but yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'd like to get into some of the nuances of fasting with you because I've tried. I was kind of gung ho on fasting for a little bit, and this was like years ago. And I would try fasts. I did like intermittent fasting where I would only eat in like an you know 8 or sometimes 4 hour window, and I felt really good fasted. And then I also tried some 1 day, 2 day, I think maybe like a 3 day fast. And I definitely felt very good at times mentally and just had a lot of clarity in some ways. And it felt pretty great in some ways with that. But then I was a little bit too dogmatic about it. I kind of like read about all the benefits of fasting and then kind of dove into it, but wasn't really paying attention to how it was affecting me overall. And I found that it definitely in in total, it kind of stressed me out a bit too much. And I think it stressed out my body a bit too much. And I could say the same thing with carnivore without any carbs. When I did carnivore, it was great in a lot of ways and it helped me with a lot of things. But then over time, I kind of lost a lot of muscle. I was kind of wasting away, especially around my shoulders, and I was really stressed all the time. I feel like my cortisol levels were really high, and I mean, it makes sense when I later looked into kind of more of the Ray Peat sphere and heard what he was saying, talking about how if you don't have glucose, then what you're one of the things that your body will do, especially if it's not producing enough ketones too and burning fat as well, you'll take muscle tissue and well you'll release cortisol as a stress hormone to go catabolic and kind of take muscle tissue and through gluconeogenesis turn that into blood sugar, right? So that's kind of why I was stressed all the time and why my muscles were wasting away and I just had no energy too. And but since I kind of had like a big shift where I changed a few things, and since then things have been way better. And one of the things that I did was just adding in white rice. And for me, white rice has worked really well. I would eat other starches if they didn't come with the other things that they come with. So potatoes, they make me feel great after I eat them, but then I'll have oxalate dumping after, and I'm sensitive to oxalates. So that's no bueno for me. And same thing with wheat or corn or anything like that. I can't do it. White rice is kind of the best one for me, but I it helps me a lot with putting on muscle, with relaxing, sleeping well. That was a big one. Muscle cramps, that was a big one. Just feeling hydrated, I suppose, and having lots of energy and muscular energy too. Like when I was no carb, I just had no glycogen in my muscles, right? And I just had no energy. And it didn't matter how long I tried to be fat adapted or anything, that didn't matter. Right? But once I added the carbs back in, it helped a lot. But yeah, I think kind of what you were saying, how sometimes it's what comes along with it, right? Maybe you have immune problems and you're you're getting inflammation every time you eat certain foods, right? And for me, like I need a little bit of vitamin C in my diet, but the problem is like almost any fruit I try, it gives me other problems. So it's like it's kind of like there are no solutions, just trade-offs. And it's like, what do I do? I've been doing just a bit of lemon in water in the morning, and that's been going pretty well. And so fingers crossed on that. But like I tried different stuff, but yeah, getting a bit of vitamin C definitely helps. But
Nice. Yeah, vitamin C is an interesting one. There's less of a need for it when you have less glucose in your
yeah,
diet because
yeah.
glucose just competes with it, right? So you can always take like supplemental base role of vitamin C as
No,
far as
I can't because
does it work.
it converts to oxalate for me, and I get
Really
oxalate problems right away if I take any ascorbic acid or even if I and it's really weird if I take any it seems to be any high vitamin C food or ascorbic acid. What happens when I'm falling asleep? I notice this because I listen to podcasts as I'm falling asleep, and if I've had high vitamin C, then I will, as I'm falling asleep, my hearing will shut off, and then and I'll kind of like fall asleep, but then I'll wake back up and slowly my hearing like comes back, and then I can like hear the podcast again, and like it's something like I don't fall into sleep correctly, and it's something weird, and I kind of wake up again, and whatever it is that I'm doing to fall into sleep, it gets disrupted for whatever reason. And it's if I have anything that's high vitamin C or has added ascorbic acid to it. It's really weird.
interesting. It's probably this is my opinion on it because I think the
Hmm.
majority of the oxalic acid production is actually endogenous, and meaning produced from within.
Yep.
think like a small portion comes from diet. The majority is coming from molds and yeast. They produce their own oxalic acid. And so when they get a hold of something like citric or ascorbic acid, they can actually convert that to, or glucose, and convert that to oxalic acid. And then they can then produce oxalates. And so that's another potential issue there. Uh, because in general, the reason why fruits are our enemy now is largely because of molds. Like, for instance, I wrote in my plant toxin article talking about cyanogenic glycosides, right? So when those make contact from the fruit the um, with an enzyme that basically converts cyanogenic glycosides into cyanide, then people have that particular like headache or migraine associated often with people who are fruit based. I think a lot of people who are fruitarians tend to have headaches or migraines. And I think a lot of it has to do with cyanide and because they're full of mold. There are particular molds that can actually produce this enzyme within our oral palate to then convert it to cyanide. And so there's just a lot of microbial interactions going on that are causing adverse health problems for us. And it's bastardizing specific foods to people, is making people think that that food is not good for them. But really, what's going on is that that food is good for the mold or good for the yeast, but bad for you because of the mold and the yeast
Hmm.
or the parasite, right? So that's where I'm really focused on that particular side of the epidemiology coin and disease study is just those microbes. When they get a hold of certain foods, they make it problematic. And that might be why for you that the white rice works, is because it's going to be a delayed glucose reaction. Like
Yeah,
if you
and
eat
because I
fruit,
eat it with a lot of suet and like beef fat, that helps a lot too because it really kind of delays the absorption of the glucose. So I get like a nice steady stream of glucose and I don't get really any blood sugar spikes. Whereas if and it's I use a certain type of white rice. I find some brands are better than others. And some, like, if I eat just plain white rice by itself, it might spike my blood sugar. But if I eat it with fat and beef, then it's pretty good.
nice. Yeah, that can be if you think about that on a microbial level, there are areas like based on any antibiotics you've taken in your life, the antibiotics wherever they fall in your intestine, as an example, they can potentially like lead to creating a fallout zone in that area. So that area may have produced and created a proliferation of fungus, and so the fungus is looking to grab onto the glucose when it meets that area. And
Hmm.
you can change where that glucose lands if you're eating rice, and say, for instance, you're doing it um, with meat and fats, that could change to where the glucose starts to become absorbed.
Hmm.
And that's why, like, they have the like fruits can be immediately inflammatory because it's like the juices are an immediate glucose that's happening right away. And you have the fructose there being processed by the liver. But a lot of us have microbes already in our oral microbiome, like, well, everyone does. And
Yeah.
so you can already get instantly inflamed. Um, so but another thing too is I think foods directly cause inflammation, regardless of the microbes. Like if you were to eat a frickin', I don't know, cornflakes for the first time in like 20 years, you might cut the roof of your mouth and you have like all this like skin being peeled off. Like, yeah, I mean, that's completely different. That's literally just because your body's not able to digest something like that
Yeah, or
anymore.
vegetable seed oils or something like.
Yeah.
Even if you were like a perfectly healthy specimen that's lived out in the wild your whole life, you're not going to do any good eating some vegetable oils.
No, no, yeah, those people would get really sick pretty quickly with our stuff. Yeah. I think that's another thing that's kind of a weird thing to think about on a political or like a real world level, where you think about a potential grid wipe or war going on, and we don't have the option to order our own specific foods for a specific diet, and we're forced to eat out of like a grocery store because that's the only thing that wasn't looted. Then we're because of us choosing the health route, we're not quite as adapted to that junk food anymore as everyone else.
I don't know if it's that. I don't know if it's that or if we just like we notice it more. Like I feel like once you go off of something and then you start to feel better and then you have it again, you're like, "Oh my God, I used to feel like that all the time." but I was just numb to it.
I'll say that our immune system is so much more active, and that's how we notice it. But the problem is that you have to now fast to break that inflammation down because you ate that candy bar to survive. Like we are so much more prone to inflammation, and that's a good thing. But it's also a bad thing if the only thing you can eat is candy bars.
What do you mean by that? That people, you're saying like people like you and I who kind of have a cleaner diet are more prone to inflammation? Because I find with myself, like whereas I used to, if I got hit with something, I would maybe get like a goose egg or something, or like a swollen lip if I got hit in the lip, anything like that. But I've had things where like, I go down a staircase railing and I fall back and I hit my head and like assume that I'm surely going to have a goosebump because that's what would always happen as a kid. But I have absolutely nothing, and it's like I'm perfectly fine. Or just anything, like even playing sports, I get way less inflammation, and just like it seems like I can't get a soft tissue injury. Like
Nice.
it, it's really
Yeah,
weird.
that's a little different. That's kind of based on that's what I was bringing up, the fact that you heal faster and the inflammation is good. It's just that the problem is that it becomes more and more chronic the more you decide to do things like eating junk food all the time. It's not the same as getting injured
Okay,
all the time.
so you get like a
It's
really sharp inflammation response, and then that does its job, and then you're all good, sort of thing.
yes, if you
I
don't
can see that.
continue to eat the junk food, because your microbiome now is focused on eating meat. So if you just put in a bunch of Snickers bars, it's not going to go very well for you. Like it will be so much more reactive and inflammatory to you than to someone who eats Snickers bars every day. That person is well adapted to the Snickers bars. And but at the same time, too, their immune system is likely less active. And
Fair,
so
fair.
they're likely to have less inflammation. But when you go through like ketosis and or you've done any fasting, you reproduce new white blood cells and they end up doing more of a they do a more stellar job. And that can mean more inflammation.
Hmm.
So the inflammation though can get cleaned up much faster, like in the situation where you're experiencing a DAMP, so damage associated molecular pattern. So you end up getting tissue that's getting destroyed. You know, your cells are going in the repair cells are going into repair said tissue much faster than before, because before you may have had a much bigger reaction, and because you at the same time are likely nutrient deficient, and or you have more disease in that area. So it just and it could also possibly create more water retention as well. And so all of these factor into creating a much worse scenario for someone who is getting injured physically. So, but when it comes to digestive related inflammation, um, it's you could argue potentially you getting readapted to eating Snickers bars and being okay, but you will most certainly notice it much more than the average person, how it negatively affects you, and it may drastically affect your mood than others, more than others. But with some though, they develop more of a resiliency. Like it's still always better than before. And so it's going to be different from each person. But
Hmm.
I know from my experience trying to go back into the normal world, it just makes a really terrible experience go on for me.
Yeah.
It almost seems impossible to go back to just any kind of eating pattern because it just feels like I feel like a zombie. I feel horrible. I feel just oof. So
Yeah, fair.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could say the same thing. I don't know if it would be the same mechanism, but you could almost say the same thing about alcohol too, right? Like an alcoholic can kind of handle more alcohol, but it's probably a different mechanism. But I was gonna ask, are you familiar with CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was recently a really good podcast. Peterson had a podcast with two experts on it, and it was really good. Um, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? I can kind of explain it quickly, but it's basically people. A lot of houses have mold in them, and and it's something like 80% apparently, and it's at toxic levels where these toxic molds. I think there's something a little bit off with this explanation, and I'll say why later. But these toxic molds are apparently um, kind of they get into our, they're really small and they get into our airways and they cause an inflammatory response. And then because they're so hard to get out and they get trapped in our bile, apparently, they kind of are constantly causing this inflammatory response. And a lot of people struggle with different things like chronic fatigue, like Lyme's disease, like I think fibromyalgia is the other one, where like under these things, they're very similar, but they have different titles, and but they're all very strongly linked with toxic mold, and people have the same symptoms. And there's this eye test where it shows that people have reduced blood flow, especially in their peripheral blood vessels, where they have really tiny blood vessels. The red blood cells don't flow through them quite as well, and so you can do this eye test, and it basically is an indicator of how well the blood vessels in your eyes are functioning, and it tells you even if you have good distance eyesight, you might not be able to see these lines, these vertical or horizontal lines, in which way they are. But anyway, there's a whole host of symptoms that people get, and and yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on how that connects to things, but
Yeah, I mean, um, yeah, that's what I was trying to say. Like back when I was saying, remember, I was referencing gout and carnivores.
mhm.
It's all in the same pattern. Like the guy who hypothesized that gout was really just, or uric acid was produced by fungus, he was saying that he made a statement and a bet towards his basically this guy's name A.V. Constantini, and he basically was saying while working for the WHO as the head of mycotoxins and food division, he was saying that uric acid is the byproduct of mycotoxicosis, and so that basically means the ingestion of molds. And so he feels absolutely certain that molds are very much connected to the production of uric acid, right? So that's all in the same pattern. Like you could also connect molds back to the mast cell and back to histamines. And you could also connect mold to, say, for instance, as you're bringing up chronic inflammation or inflammatory response syndrome. So molds are just so ubiquitous today. You would reference 80% of homes, right? So a lot of home manufacturers are trying to use like a kind of cornstarch to prevent molds by putting it into drywall, but this still attracts molds.
Mhm.
And so the majority of homes, I would absolutely believe it, have mold in them. Even the new builds, if they sit out in the rain at all, like they probably accumulate some mold.
Yeah, any water damage seems to initiate it. And the thing, the nuance that I want to get into is, okay, so they said that this problem started in the 70s, I believe, and it only started because they'd have mold before. Houses would get moldy after water damage before, but they never had this problem before. And what they did was they started spraying or covering the drywall with this antifungal, and it's basically toxins that are designed to kill fungus and molds. And so remembering that they're toxins, like it's just toxic chemicals put on drywall. Okay, that whatever it was, it I don't know how effective it is at stopping the mold growth, but ever since they started doing that, that's when the mold has been bothering people. And I'm wondering if it's not purely the mold itself, if it's not that the mold is breaking down toxic building materials, and those toxic building materials they're being broken down, and then maybe paired with the mold spores are being ingested, and then somewhat like how a vaccine is designed to work, somewhat like that, where there's an an adjuvant, as in the toxin that's been applied to the drywall is the adjuvant, and it induces an immune response. And then the mold is the biological material that's recognized as the invader or the pathogen. And so your immune system is now chronically inflamed to these molds, possibly whether or not the toxin is present in future cases or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I've been I've approached that debate quite a bit in the terrain world.
Hmm.
Um, that is absolutely true. Uh, but I will say that molds, while people are only charting it back to say the 70s, it's they just didn't have anything to really truly label it to when people were going through inflammatory reactions like hundreds of years ago, because that's been around forever. People have always been reactive to mold. That's the reason why trees produce something called phytoncides that our immune system uses to fight off mold.
Hmm.
Our bodies are specifically designed to fight mold off all of the time. And it could have a much bigger reaction if these molds are bringing in xenobiotics like those chemicals
Right.
into our bodies, right? That'll be a much bigger reaction. But people generally thousands of years ago were still incredibly violent and incredibly like poor mannered and poor just had poor mood and had poor health, and that largely may have been, you could attribute that to nutritional deficiencies and people who are in poverty. But there are plenty of people who were quite wealthy and they had plenty of great nutrition, and they still were incredibly violent, sometimes sexually violent. And a lot of them were incredibly just diseased. Like they would get sick and they lived only so long. And people today are like, well, thanks to antibiotics. But in reality, people have always been doing diet wrong. And while a lot of them didn't live the most sanitary lives, if they had been eating the right diet, they wouldn't have to worry too much about the sanitization of things and the living space that they were in. Because I mean, when it comes to sewers and all that crud, like that's made up of all the toxic foods they're eating and all the things that they're doing each day that are toxic. And, if you go back to say when Jesus was around, if it was a society made up of people eating what they're supposed to be eating, they wouldn't actually have, not only would there be no desire to do what they did to him, to have all that kind of hate, they would similarly have men in that sphere who would fight anyone who would try to perpetuate that kind of BS. And they wouldn't be so cowardly either, to where they're like, "Oh, I'm afraid of what they would do to me if I said something."
Hmm.
So high testosterone men are just like, "I'm going to go get the job done. I don't care if I die." They're risk takers and they
Yep.
believe in truth. So people have always been sick, and the reason why isn't always just what they're eating, it's what proliferates after what they eat. So molds, yeasts, they've been around in our cells forever, and they know how to facilitate a means of getting their own food sources while stimulating our cravings, which can lead to endocrine disruption, which can lead to people having neurotransmitter signaling that leads them to become more violent and angry and upset, mood swings, like, or they become petty and they're not quite
Mhm.
they're just so much more sinful. Like
Yeah.
people, I had this whole speech on the religion side a while ago with Rich Colburn on it, and how there's a plane of health where everyone could actually be like Jesus, where you don't have those prejudices. It's because disease is what brings all of that on. And so, going back to the mold thing, molds in homes, yes, a lot of homes are made of toxic material. But if you were to make a teepee and it was full of mold and there was no toxic material in it, you would still get sick.
Okay, that's what I
Like,
wanted to ask. Yeah, like I think we could agree on that. Like if perhaps with toxins added to it, you need less of an amount of mold, perhaps. But
um,
either way, if you're overwhelmed with mold, then it's going to be a problem. Would you say that or?
um, so I'm saying that, like, regardless of toxicity, like if you had like a saying the TP that has no
Mhm.
toxins, you would still get sick from the mold inside the TP fort, because you don't have trees around you to defend you, or you don't have the right diet to defend you. But ultimately, microbes are always trying to take you over and to have opportunity to
Yeah, they're
have
just
more
waiting
for
for the day
themselves.
you die. They're going to start.
Right. And
Yeah,
it's the same thing as the world around us. Bears, wolves, they
yeah,
will be there for when you're weak.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
how microbes are.
Exactly.
Everything in the world that lives is here to consume you if you
Yeah.
decide to be less strong.
Yeah.
And so that's basically what I'm trying to bring up is how molds are opportunistic and they can use xenobiotics like that to potentially cause us more problems.
I
Um,
feel like trees are like standing there like tall their whole lives, but then like as they get weak, they're just like oh no, like these molds and funguses and they're all gonna get me. Like it must be terrifying just standing there, just slowly being eaten by mold and stuff.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing that we're lucky to have though as humans is we have these incredibly robust immune systems. Some species of trees get entirely overtaken by one particular fungus that keeps spreading from tree to tree to tree.
Would you say similar to how I would assume you would believe it to be in humans that that's because those are weaker trees in some way or another? Like perhaps the soil wasn't good for them, or because they're not well nourished, so their immune systems aren't functioning as well.
Yeah, so it would be terrain based in that
Yeah.
sense, where the tree perhaps is just genetically not fit for the current state of the geography that it's in.
Hmm.
Maybe it's been there for thousands of years, and then the world's changed, and then
Yeah.
it's no longer able to survive
And
there.
the mold is the great equalizer, and it just
Yeah,
you're no longer good enough and takes it down.
yeah, and that's why cedar trees out here just don't. They just kill everything. Like nothing can take
Oh
down a
yeah.
cedar tree.
Cedar trees are the oldest trees in Ontario where I am, and like some of them, they're like really small. Some of them are like 5 feet tall, and they grow at the side of a rock with like it looks like there's no like soil or nutrients for it, but it's like it'll be some of them are like I think 1,600 years old, and they're just tiny. It's
Yeah,
hilarious.
extremely robust. Yeah. So some things are just genetically better at handling the problem. And
Well, some of them, I think they take like a slow growth strategy where they grow really slowly and then so there's nothing really to eat because they're growing so slowly, right?
mm,
It's kind of like grasses are just like they just grow their strategy is to just grow abundantly and then like there's so much of it and there's not much nutrition per blade of grass so like they don't have to worry about being eaten much, right? But I wanna get more into what you were speaking on with because what you were saying there with molds and people being sick being more sinful, that sounds like I totally understand what you're saying, but I would reckon most people hear that as like crazy talk. And I want to get into more of why you believe that to be the case, and we can talk about kind of perhaps we can talk about the mechanisms for why that is actually pragmatically the case. And it's a lot of ways of looking at it. It's not too complicated, but I'll let you talk more about that. But why are you saying that somebody who is more sick is more likely to be sinful, to be hateful, to be violent in unproductive ways? Why would you say that?
so a real simple one that I like to bring up the most is because it's probably the most ubiquitous, is when you consume too much, glucose in the diet, maybe you eat too many grains, which comes with that more glucose. And those grains, they'll come with lectins as well, and they start stripping our gut lining and, making deleterious, slow, but, strong effects over time to compromise the gut. This can inevitably lead to the colonization of those areas of the gut with fungi. Okay. And say, for instance, there were no antibiotics back then, so there's no fallout zones. But people back then did experience chronic stress while on these diets that weren't inhibitive of chronic stress to the point that it's actually causing acute problems. So if you're, say, for instance, you going back to how you get injuries and they're not quite as bad anymore, it's the same mentally. So if you were to eat like a diet that's carnivorous and you have a lot of B vitamins, these B vitamins act as kind of a buffer by producing neurotransmitters, like helping the production of serotonin, as an example. The neurotransmitters help to create like this peace in your mind, this kind of like, okay, nothing can affect me. And you experience stress in that state of mind, it's different for you than the next person. The next person might take that stress and make trauma out of it. That person then has a permanent problem. Okay. And so kids today, I often experience, like, for instance, for instance, they do something really bad and they're disciplined for something. They have these kinds of psychology studies where they were taking kids who were in like a juvenile hall, and they have one group they discipline, one group they discipline another group. Both groups were disciplined, but one group was given B vitamins, the other was given the placebo. Okay, the placebo group was hateful, resentful, and angry towards the situation. They were very like not able to understand anything. They're like, well, why did this happen? And I think this is terrible and I hate you guys, right?
Mhm.
And the other group though was they understood it. They're like, okay, yeah, well, no big deal. Like I get it. I did this thing and so I deserve it. And so they had a entirely different, peaceful perspective on it. The other just went into like an like just they went right to their emotions and that's all they're seeing is red. So B vitamins are absolutely crucial to that, and I believe a lot of this has to do with neurotransmitter production because of the B vitamins. Okay, so when you have fungus in your gut growing all over the place because of your diet, they produce something called acetaldehyde. Okay, it's a derivative from fungus that is neurotoxic, and it can also destroy the production of serotonin in the gut.
Is
95%.
acetaldehyde also the byproduct of alcohol that kind of is theorized to cause the hangovers?
Yes.
Right. And it's
Yeah. And
also really high in vegetable seed oils, right? When they, part of the manufacturing process, when they use high heat, it produces a lot of acetaldehydes, I believe.
yeah. And a lot of time, too, like for instance, like ethanol can be produced from the consumption of glucose as well from other microbes, ammonia as well. So these kinds of derivatives are deleterious to our neurotransmitter functioning. So when we are supposed to be producing the serotonin for our gut-brain axis, the gut-brain axis is 80% afferent, meaning they're sending signals from the gut up, right? And so serotonin is a part of that. And so if you're inhibiting your serotonin production, this is the reason why carnivores tend to be better at handling hard debates or handling hard things in life. Like if you bring this up to someone who's plant-based, it can just become very erratic and they get really anxious towards a lot of very small things.
Hmm.
And so these people tend to be dysregulated with their neurotransmitters.
I've made a whole
So,
video series about this.
oh, good.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So but generally this is the problem is like people in the past, way past, people today are trying to connect it back to chemicals, but that's not entirely true. Like thousands of years ago, people have been erratic and stupid and ridiculous, right? And so it largely has to do with the fact that they're just not eating right. And if they were all to be eating mostly meat based and they produced enough serotonin, they would be so much more peaceful. And the men wouldn't be so effeminate to the point that they're not doing anything, to the point that they're watching this man just get just bled dry, even though he's like you know, probably the best man that's ever existed. And so it's absolutely crazy, like the absolute inaction that occurred. And it's crazy that some people enjoyed watching it or enjoyed giving it, right? So this is just, you could trace that all the way back to neurotransmitters and all the way back to the microbes in their body. And then to start, it's what they're eating, their choices that lead to all these problems. And so that's the whole argument that I try to bring up is like there's the mental illness that exists today, a lot of it's based on our own choices from having chosen to eat really bad foods. And so it's just that's the most base issue. And so biochemically, you have to think about neurotransmitters. Like the one big one that I like to use, and I'll be done after this, is acetylcholine. Okay, acetylcholine helps you with memory retention. So there's all kinds of supplements that people take to take acetylcholine so that they can boost their ability to learn while they're going through school, right? But acetylcholine is more than that. It also helps you regulate your anger and the emotion behind that. And a lot of people don't know that serotonin regulates acetylcholine to make it more efficient. Okay, so if your serotonin's inhibited, your acetylcholine's like this. And so if your acetylcholine isn't operating as it should, you this is my theoretical example. I don't have a lot of evidence on it, but I've been using it to help people to accept new truths. And it's how I've helped people get past very, very big problems in their lives psychologically. Is that I believe acetylcholine inhibits us in a lot of ways because it's kind of like acetylcholine, if it's not working as it should, is kind of like having a cup that's totally full versus a cup that's only half full or like very little from being full. So a lot of people have full cups, and I call this that's where cognitive dissonance comes from, and I call it the subconscious brain fog. So that's why I stumbled upon this when I was realizing when working with all these carnivores. It's like, carnivores seem to have like their cups not entirely full for some reason. Like, why is it that they can accept new information, change their politics, change their religion purely based on the logic I give to them? But if I give logic to anyone else who doesn't eat that diet, it tends to hit like a wall. They're like, I'm not interested in what you have to say. And I want to just kind of suppress that and kind of not think about it. Right. And so I realized that there's a metabolic means of opening up the brain, so to speak, and allowing people in new truths to accept them as like, even if they're hard and not well digested. And so acetylcholine, I believe, is very important in that whole equation with the serotonin as well. And so there are many more biochemical reactions that go on, I'm sure, that I'm not entirely detailing here, but I will say that those are the primary ones that I look to, and I look to moderate those with diet. And I can get people to essentially have be better people than the people who were that alive thousands of years ago, even in this super toxic world today.
Hmm.
So anyway, yeah.
I want to share my perspective on how I see that with serotonin as well, because obviously like things, you know, can be approached from different angles and have different causes. But first, I want to say, you ever take acetylcholine like as a supplement?
I had before. I didn't really notice very much difference though.
Yeah. I notice with me, I notice it's really weird. I have better rhythm. So I feel like if I'm like in the car just like drumming on the steering wheel, or like I drum a little bit but like not much, but like I can drum better if I've had taken acetylcholine. It's really weird. And I also it helps me. I rarely ever take it, but like I've sometimes taken it playing sports, and it kind of helps me get in the zone, I've found. And yeah, I wonder how much that has to do with sleep as well, because so much of our emotional regulation is kind of built up during REM sleep, in that second half of our sleep. And that's when we kind of deal with emotional things, and kind of we go through whatever was emotional, and then our brain kind of goes like, oh, that's actually not that important, and kind of like lets it go. And so it kind of disassociates the emotion from whatever happened to you, and so instead of it clinging to you and like being traumatic, it's just like you let go of it. But with what you were saying with serotonin, so the video series that I made explaining why social justice warriors are always so anxious and and uh and just like angry all the time and irritable. So there's two of the main things, other than endocrine disrupting chemicals, which I think play a role. Two of the main nutritional things I found were cholesterol and iron. And one thing I didn't know this before about cholesterol, cholesterol helps with serotonin signaling. And I mean, you know this, but serotonin basically makes you feel relax and at peace with yourself, and kind of like, oh, things are good, I can relax, and it inhibits violence, right? So when you don't have that serotonin, or you don't have serotonin signaling properly because of low cholesterol perhaps, or because of low acetylcholine, or for a variety of reasons, um, you're not gonna your violence isn't gonna be inhibited, and you're not gonna be as relaxed, and you're not gonna be as satiated and feeling as good. And with with iron, I notice this a lot because like so many like social justice warriors are kind of vegan and plant-based. And so cholesterol is like a big one, right? Because cholesterol can only be found in animal foods and it's not at all in plants. It always like makes me laugh when some like plant food says like that it's like got zero cholesterol and it's like yeah, obviously it's got no cholesterol in it. But iron is another big one. And the way I look at it, it's very pretty much what you were just describing. It's just I've been putting it into different terms, but I like the way you're saying it. I like if somebody is weak and vulnerable, like they're going to view the world as a terrible, dangerous place. Like if somebody is more prone to infection, if somebody is more prone to injury, like if you're iron deficient, you're going to bruise really easily. Like I used to bruise really easily, and like since eating meat, I just don't bruise whatsoever. And bruising is so normalized today. Like everybody, like you point out a bruise on somebody, and they're like, "Oh yeah, like I play soccer and like you hit with a ball." It's like, no, like you should not bruise. Like if you're bruising, that's a sign that you need to eat more iron. It's as simple as that. Like just eat more red meat until that bruising stops completely. But anyway, if you're bruising, like you're vulnerable. Like you're vulnerable to getting injured, and then that injury doesn't heal as well. So your body is going to be more on guard, more more threatened to harm, and is going to view the world as a more harmful place. And you kind of stay away. And Randy Thornhill has done research on it. His theory is what is it? Parasite stress theory of values, and he talks about how he puts it on a left right political spectrum, but I argue it's not left right at all. It's just authoritarian to liberal or libertarian spectrum. And basically the more sick you are, the more parasites you have, the more prone you are to authoritarian political beliefs or just attitudes, the more you want borders, uh, the more you want somebody to rule like with an iron fist, and the less you want to be kind of libertarian and just like let everybody do what they want to do, leave me alone, you do what you want to do, but leave me alone. You know, when you're sick and when you're vulnerable, you're like life is awful for you. So you're more willing to be like, let's burn it all to the ground. And you're also more willing to give up your power because you're in a terrible spot. You're more willing to give up your power to some guy who has some macho appearance, like but like is really not. And you know, you're like, you take the reins. I want you to be the leader because things are awful for me and maybe you can do better. So you take all of my freedom, take my freedoms away, please. Just keep me safe because I'm so vulnerable, right? But people who are strong and healthy are just like, no, 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 like I'll handle things. Like you stick to yourself, just leave me be. I've got things under control. And that's kind of how I see it. But with cholesterol too, there low cholesterol is associated with autism spectrum disorders. It's associated with schizophrenia and other mood disorders. It's associated with depression. It's associated with suicide and self-harm. And these things are all very, very common more today, especially amongst the social justice warrior type people. And yeah, it's very common, and there's obviously a pattern there.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's all. It's all connected.
Yeah, I see it as cholesterol. What cholesterol does, I see a bit of a fractal pattern. So cholesterol in the cell membrane, it helps the cell be more fluid when it needs to be, but also keep its structure when it needs to. So if it's really cold out, cholesterol helps it from freezing and being like brittle, I guess, or it, you know, and it cholesterol allows the cell to be still a little fluid even when it's cold out. Or if it's too hot, cholesterol helps it be not too fluid and just, you know, liquid. Cholesterol helps it keep its shape and its structure. And it does that on a cellular level, but people with low cholesterol also don't have this dynamic stability either in their emotional state. You know, they're very reactive to anything, and they don't maintain themselves, their coolness, and they don't maintain their personality. Like, they're very susceptible to dynamic changes, right? They're not dynamic themselves.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I love that. That whole perspective of the cell anatomically just being made up of not just like carbohydrates, but cholesterol
Mhm.
and fatty acids and proteins. Like basically, there's honestly there's this argument like in the fasting sphere because you have autophagy or you have apoptosis that occurs. There's the potential your body will just try to overwrite all the inefficient cells that are made up of all the crud, and you replace them with cells that are just full of impactful nutrition like cholesterol. Yeah, cholesterol is so it's such an interesting topic because you can get into how parasites can stimulate the liver to produce more cholesterol, which can lead to higher like if you go and do like a lipid panel and you're trying to get your cholesterol down, but in a lot of ways like you may just be loaded with parasites and has nothing to do with your diet, but then your diet also ends up raising the cholesterol levels, and then so it's kind of ambiguous as to like what exactly is a pathology and what is actually really good for you, right? Pathology meaning disease. So if you have someone who is loaded with parasites, they could just have really bad lipid results. Or but if you like you have someone who's eating meat based and they're like eating carnivore and they're loaded with parasites, it's likely their lipid panel won't look super great. Um, Even APOB is shown to be elevated by parasites as well. So it's kind of
Okay.
like when people try to bring up this whole cardiovascular debate of disease and how like cholesterol's in the center of it all, and what's the problem? I mean, cholesterol is mostly inhibitory towards disease. It helps you. Um, but another thing too is parasites try to elevate it to actually help them to cultivate more growth. So it gets really complicated in that whole
Mm.
feature. And cholesterol is just it's super important. And also, if you're a vegan, your body just produces I don't know like 1,000 milligrams a day or something like that, 500, a
Yeah, it's
thousand.
around
Um,
800 said to be.
okay, yeah, and then like so it'll just produce its own supply on on a need based basis, and that is literally every day. And this is really taxing on the liver, though. I mean, if you could just provide yourself
Mhm.
exogenous cholesterol from outside, I mean, you free up your liver to do more of its processes as it
Yeah, well,
should.
it's really expensive to make, and it's largely, uh, you know, there was a study on Finnish children that were either vegan, vegetarian, or omnivorous, and they found that um, it was basically that, yeah, like the vegans were making cholesterol, but it wasn't enough, and it wasn't enough for them, and not only that, like their bile production, because they were getting no taurine from their vegan diets, or at least remarkably little taurine, their bile production, because bile is made out of taurine, glycine, phospholipids, and cholesterol. They weren't making any bile, or not enough bile, and so their fat soluble vitamin stores were low as well, because you need bile to absorb fat soluble vitamins. So their vitamin D was low, their vitamin A was low. Those were the two they studied, but they were both incredibly low. And
Yeah.
yeah, basically they concluded that, yeah, they're making cholesterol, but it's not enough.
Nice. Yeah.
Right. Low cholesterol is also associated with, like you were saying, how it inhibits disease. It's associated. Low cholesterol is associated with increased risk of infections.
Yeah. You also need it to, like, for instance, the reason why it's like oftentimes coating the arterial lining is because it's stopping chronic inflammation or damage
Mhm.
from inflammation. This is another thing where I try to get people to fast. Like, if you fast, you break down inflammation, you create less of that blockage. Your
Mhm.
body's going to make that blockage for good reasons. Um, but yeah, it's that arterial plaque that builds up is largely due to mismanaged inflammation and driven insulin resistance as an example can also be. a connecting factor to
Yeah,
higher
it inflames
cholesterol
the
levels.
blood vessel walls too, and it also oxidizes the cholesterol, the like the LDL particles, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So, and there's a lot of misassociations with cholesterol. I think that largely it's more helpful than anything. But
Mm.
targeting the reason for its elevation is more important. And triglycerides are probably the one that you want to focus more on.
Yeah.
It's because a lot of people are in the carnivore world are eating like low quality meat just to afford it, and then all of a sudden they have too many omega 6s in their diet, and it creates an imbalance. You need to have more omega 3. So, yep.
Mm. Do you take any supplements?
Lately, I've been finding a lot of benefit behind taking calcium, and because I've been eating raw meat, and it's really challenging to get bone-based
Yeah.
minerals raw. So I've been eating calcium or consuming, or sorry, taking it as a supplement calcium. But I also buy sardines, even though they're cooked, to also get more calcium. Uh, and magnesium as usual, because there's not much absorption of that calcium without it, and people lose it all the time. Another reason is like EMFs, they cause the muscle contractions to displace magnesium and calcium on a regular basis.
Hmm.
um, I think if there's anything that people are really low on a consistent basis, it can be calcium and magnesium. Even if they're drinking copious amounts of raw milk, not all of that's being absorbed. um, and so those are the two primary ones that I'm taking in general. I also take organ supplements if I can't afford to go and get like a whole cow or something and can't get all of my needs met. So anytime
Like
that I'm
uh
not,
like some
uh,
desiccated liver type stuff or
yeah, yeah, there's a chemist here in town. She makes a really cool B vitamin supplement that also has B17 in it. So that's the apricot seed B17. It's known for creating, I think this also creates cyanide, but it's also used to kill pathogens in your body. It's super
oh,
interesting.
cool.
I mean, it's because if people are trying to figure out why the Hunza live for so long, and like how it's often correlated with the fact that they ate a bunch of apricot seeds, like it's potentially because of B17. It's potentially, but I think it also might have just been because they lived happy lives and they had a
Yeah.
good social setting. But yeah, so I basically I take that B vitamin supplement, so it's full of all the B vitamins that I need throughout the day. I prefer to eat like a whole liver though to cover my bases, like not a whole liver, but about 50 grams of a liver,
Yeah.
not each day,
Not
just
one whole
every
cow
now and then.
liver.
Yeah, no, no
How
way.
much do those things weigh?
Um,
They're probably like 5 pounds. I don't know.
yeah,
Maybe
they
more.
could be about 5 pounds if you're incorporating the fat that's attached to it. It could be even
Right.
more than that.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so I just cover my bases with
Hmm.
supplements. So it's not always a daily pattern of taking the same supplement. It's just whatever I know I'm not getting. And that could be hard to do without nutritional knowledge. Like,
Right. Yeah.
because I know what I'm eating every day. I know how many grams of fat are in the sardines. I know how many proteins are in it. And I know based on my size what I'm going to need to get each day to prevent either weight loss or to prevent nutritional deficiency.
Yeah.
And I moderate it based on my environment. Okay, I'm living in town. I'm getting hit by EMFs. I'm going to make sure I get calcium and magnesium. And uh, I take iodine pretty regularly
Hmm.
because I don't suspect the fish that I even get in my diet has enough of it.
Hmm.
And yeah, just whatever is not available. So
Hmm.
I'll take that. But sometimes I mess around with taking zinc as well. I don't ever go over 50 milligrams in a day. Um, 25 is a good medium for people. Even if I'm meat based, I get favorable results taking zinc.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
I take a little bit of it too. I take a really tiny bit. I find my like zinc, copper, vitamin C balance is like really tricky. So like it's really tricky for me taking any of those, but I've been doing just like a little bit of zinc and that's been fine. Do you ever take magnesium in the form of magnesium sulfate like in a bath?
yeah, I mean, I've done magnesium sulfate baths. I've also done this. crazy liver detoxes with it. And it has its merits for sure.
Oh, it
But
tastes so bad.
yeah, yeah, I definitely don't like on a regular basis ever take that. But the magnesium I tend to gravitate to is well, sometimes like it depends. Like if I'm trying to like if I'm not going as frequently as I should be, I'll take the oxy powder one.
Hmm.
Um, but like a key kind of like a chelated magnesium would be better. I don't mind it being like a magnesium glycinate though. It'll still absorb. It's just that uh, I generally have a preference for just making sure I like get like yeah, glycinate is okay. Like and then comparatively, the oxy powder one is just purely to get things out. Um, you could also use herbal remedies to move stool along. Like that's another topic of concern, like with people in the health space is, is it is really important that you go pretty often
Hmm.
because it just starts to build up in the intestine and it creates a whole bunch of issues. You may not notice it on carnivore for some time as an example, but it definitely can compact and create issues.
Yeah, I
So
found I wasn't going nearly enough with just carnivore, and adding in carbs helped like just move my digestive system. That's what I found. Like I was like eating all this protein and fat, but I had no fire. My furnace wasn't burning hot. And so carbs just kind of added something to the furnace. And that's how I kind of view it, as like a fire, where carbs are kind of like the oxygen to the fire. And they make it burn, they make things burn hotter, but you don't want just oxygen on your fire because you're going to burn out of wood real soon. So, you need to have a good amount of wood, which is like your protein and your fat and your other nutrients. But and then I also found that vitamin B1 in the form of I think it's TTFD form, but I forget what that's called. It's the fat soluble one, TTFD. Thiamax is the one. That one's really good, but that paired with biotin helped me, like my bowel movements are like really consistent and easy, and like feels good in that. But
nice,
I noticed it after adding the biotin, and I know biotin and the B1 kind of work together. But yeah,
very nice.
and then maybe one last thing we could talk about a little bit more about. You were mentioning with the purines, and I'm gonna pick your brain because I've got all sorts of weird things about me, as you can tell. But one weird thing is that a lot of times if I eat organ meats, and I haven't for like a long time now because I just don't bother anymore. But and it's not because I think that they're bad necessarily, but if I eat them, like if I eat liver or kidney or brain, um, I I just feel really weird. I feel like almost dizzy at times, almost high at times. Uh, like my sleep is weird, and it's a very strange feeling, and it's been a while, so I might not be remembering the details that well, but I know you were mentioning about the purines, and I believe organ meats are very high in purines. Do you have any insight into what might be going on there?
I think it's back to what I was already connecting it to is fungus. If you think about purines, think about fungus. Think about molds. Think about yeast. Think about your intestines where you may have had antibiotics. Think about why you might need rice and why you may react to a certain amount of glucose in diet or why certain mineral ratios are affecting you. You can always draw these things back to fungi that are taking over areas of our body anatomically. And because they take over different areas of the body for each person, and genetics also apply, it makes everyone think that their problem is particularly unique to them or that no one else can fix their issue because they're uniquely going through this problem or they need to take this particular drug because they have that unique problem. And you could just trace it all the way back to a root of it, like going after yeast and fungus would be the one means of moderating that experience. Like I've definitely over the years, worked with people who have these issues when they consume either high histamine foods or high purine foods, and they have these. these bad reactions, you can get them to a place where that doesn't really happen as much anymore. And two methods I use are to go antifungal or to go and to dry fast. So these two things are the most potent against getting rid of molds. And that's all I know is that purine sensitivity or purines turning into uric acid or histamine sensitivity tends to go down when you get rid of more fungus. And so I'm pretty certain that they're the central cause of the issue, just largely. And I think that's the reason why people, again, have to go meat based to a very extreme extent to get any level of remission. And it's because the fungi don't do well in low glucose environments. And so they end up suppressed and they're not quite as active. And so that's where I had first started, was focusing on fungus. And eventually I started researching parasites and getting parasites out of people and all the things they cause. They're all different. They all do different things. Some of the molds even cause you to be endocrine disrupted, become more effeminate or masculine, depending on your sex. Um, so there's a lot of research behind that, but then there's so much more to learn because the microbiome is not well explored. We definitely tend to focus on the bad guys, right? The ones that are more opportunistic. I don't call them bad because I just think of the world as opportunistic. They're wolves. Do you call wolves bad? Do you call bears bad? Like
Yeah.
they're just trying to survive and they're doing what they can to do that and they will take resources from you. And you have to get ahead of them. You got to break them down. And we create more of them based on our society today. Either our eating choices, the stress that we live with those eating choices, or we take antibiotics and we destroy our bacteria that are supposed to defend us, or the probiotics that are available on the market aren't the ones we really need. The ones we really need could be like bacteria that we're all afraid of, like E. coli and Salmonella. These guys help us to even like E. coli. There's a derivative, and they make a drug out of it. It's called Nuprogen. Helps you to produce white blood cells or neutrophils, and to help us facilitate more immune health. Like, but E. coli is bastardized, or Salmonella, and people think that that's really gonna really, or it's really bad for us. But in reality, they're just more aggressive and helpful. And not to say that all of them are entirely good because I can't make that absolute stipulation, but I know that much of it is very much essential to our health.
Asa, I've really, really enjoyed talking with you. What? So you're into functional health and you do some health coaching, I believe. Can you just tell people a bit about what you do, how they could reach you, and if they're interested in working with you? I believe you'll work online with clients.
Yeah, yeah. So you can reach me at well, that's actually it's polarizinghealth.com. It's right now on Google. It's not really searchable. I just changed the name. So Gut Goals LLC, though, is on Google. My name you can Google, and you can Google my name on Bing. You can also, I'm very active on Facebook. That's the most
Yeah,
active place for me. So if you just
I can put
ASA
some
and then
links in.
yeah, ASA and then Santiago. You can look me up. I'm pretty easy to find. And just know that I have a personal profile. That's not the one to add. The one to add, that's the professional profile that has a lot more stuff on it. That one is the one that has a cowboy hat on it. That one has more stuff. So
Nice.
go ahead and add me there or follow, whichever. And yeah, you can reach out if you want one-to-one services, or you can just follow my content.
And what type of people do you work with?
People who are anything and everything within the sphere of, well, I can't call it disease, but dis-ease.
Yeah.
People who have significant health issues. I work from a broad, holistic perspective on that. And even if I've never worked with that particular issue, I figure out how to solve it. Like, I'm pretty adept at working within a space where you have to create the resolution. Like, I'm not the kind of practitioner you go to who's going to give you a streamlined approach where they created cookie cutter models that work for all these particular things. I've created all of my own things, and that's just what I do. So if I haven't created it yet, you can come to me and I can start it with you. So I also work with people who have sexual dysfunction and want to have like to just normalize with how they think in that space. And so I do a lot of stuff also with making men very masculine or women more feminine. It's another thing I do. So just all
Nice.
that health stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we need a lot of that, and that's good that you give nice individualized approaches.
Yeah. Oh, well,
Sweet.
thanks for having me, Brendan.
Well, thanks a lot. I could talk with you all day. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah, you too.
All
Thank you.
right. Well, stick around. Take care.
All right.